The most dangerous mistake a person can make is laughing at someone whose story they have not finished reading. The Richmond District Courthouse in Virginia was unusually quiet that Tuesday morning, but beneath the polished floors and towering marble columns, something felt wrong. The air carried a heaviness that no one could explain, as if the building itself knew that a carefully hidden truth was about to surface. People moved through security checkpoints with tired faces, lawyers adjusted their ties, and clerks shuffled stacks of paperwork under fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead. Then she walked in. Aaliyah Carter, a 37-year-old black woman with calm eyes and an unreadable expression, crossed the lobby wearing a navy blazer, dark slacks, and simple glasses that made her almost invisible to everyone around her. She was not trying to attract attention. In fact, she seemed to blend into the background on purpose. She carried a small black briefcase in one hand and a leather folder in the other. Nothing about her appearance screamed authority, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She quietly took a seat near the front of the courtroom while people whispered around her without realizing she could hear every word. Officer Daniel Briggs noticed her immediately. He was a 43-year-old white police officer with a reputation for arrogance and an unhealthy confidence that came from years of never being challenged. He leaned back in his chair and smirked when he saw her reviewing documents. Then he laughed loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Look at that, another person who thinks carrying papers makes them important." A few officers standing beside him chuckled under their breath. Aaliyah did not react. She simply turned a page and kept reading. Briggs leaned toward another officer and shook his head. "They always walk in here acting like they belong." Still, she remained perfectly still. Imagine sitting in a room where strangers decide who deserves respect before you have even spoken a single word. Imagine hearing someone reduce your entire existence to a joke, while everyone around you pretends not to notice. Aaliyah had experienced moments like this before, but today was different. Today she was not there to defend herself. Today she was there to watch. Every movement inside that courtroom mattered. Every careless sentence mattered. Every laugh mattered. Across the room, Briggs stood up and walked toward her with a grin that carried years of unchecked entitlement. He folded his arms and looked down at her. "You lost, ma'am? This area is for important people." A few spectators lowered their eyes while others awkwardly pretended to organize their belongings. Aaliyah slowly closed her folder and looked up at him without anger or fear. There was something unsettling about her calmness, but Briggs did not notice. He only saw what he expected to see. He laughed again and walked away, completely unaware that the woman he had just mocked was silently recording every second of his behavior in her memory. Hidden inside her briefcase was a sealed file that had taken 11 months to build. And while Officer Daniel Briggs thought he was beginning another ordinary day at work, he had already stepped into the most important investigation of his entire life. He just did not know it yet. The longer Officer Daniel Briggs stayed comfortable, the more dangerous he became, because people who are never questioned eventually begin to believe they are untouchable. The courtroom slowly filled with attorneys, reporters, and citizens waiting for the morning proceedings to begin. Outside the tall windows, gray clouds drifted over Richmond, while inside, the atmosphere remained cold and heavy. Aaliyah Carter quietly opened another folder and reviewed a list of names that had been carefully organized over the past 11 months. Some belonged to officers, some belonged to city employees, and others belonged to people who had spent years hiding behind positions of authority. She did not rush. She did not appear nervous. Her patience was the result of years of training that taught her one simple rule. The truth always reveals itself when people think nobody important is watching. Across the room, Daniel Briggs continued entertaining the officers around him. He laughed loudly, making himself the center of attention. Every joke he made seemed designed to remind others that he believed he controlled the room. Then his eyes returned to Aaliyah once again. He walked over and glanced at the black briefcase beside her chair. "That is an expensive bag for someone sitting quietly all morning," he said with a grin. Aaliyah calmly looked up at him. She offered no reaction. No anger. No frustration. That silence only encouraged him further. He shook his head and laughed. "You know, people like you always show up carrying documents and acting official. Everybody wants to be somebody these days." Nearby, a young court clerk named Emily Foster watched the exchange unfold. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat because something about Aaliyah felt different. It was not her clothes or her posture. It was the way she carried absolute confidence without ever needing to announce it. Emily had worked in the courthouse for 3 years and had learned to recognize people who demanded authority and people who naturally possessed it. Aaliyah belonged to the second group. She noticed Emily looking her way and offered a small reassuring smile. That single gesture immediately put Emily at ease. Meanwhile, Briggs continued speaking to another officer. This one probably thinks she runs the place. He laughed again, unaware that every word was quietly being documented by more than one source. Hidden inside Aaliyah's folder were official reports, internal communications, and witness statements collected from people who had been afraid to speak publicly for years. Every file connected back to the same pattern: disrespect, misconduct, selective enforcement, abuse of authority, and one name appeared over and over again: Officer Daniel Briggs. Aaliyah closed the folder and rested her hand on top of it. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to think about all the people she had met during this investigation. Teachers, nurses, veterans, parents, people who simply wanted to be treated fairly. Their stories had brought her here. This was never about revenge. It was about accountability. Then the courtroom doors opened again. Judge Raymond Cole entered and everyone stood. The room immediately fell silent. But beneath that silence, another story was unfolding. A story that nobody except Aaliyah understood yet. She was not waiting for justice to arrive. She had already brought it with her. And somewhere deep inside, Officer Daniel Briggs was only minutes away from making the biggest mistake of his entire career. People reveal who they truly are when they believe there will never be consequences. Judge Raymond Cole adjusted his glasses and began reviewing the morning docket while everyone settled into their seats. The courtroom returned to its normal rhythm, but Aaliyah Carter noticed something nobody else seemed to recognize. There was an invisible pattern connecting the people inside this room. Small glances were exchanged. Certain names received special treatment. Certain conversations stopped the moment outsiders approached. It was subtle, but it was there. She had spent her entire career learning how to detect these behaviors. Corruption rarely announced itself. It grew quietly inside comfortable environments where nobody expected accountability. Officer Daniel Briggs leaned against a wooden railing and smiled, as if he owned the entire courthouse. Every person who passed him offered a greeting or a nod of approval. That confidence had been built over many years, and confidence without limits often became arrogance. Aaliyah quietly opened another document and reviewed a timeline she had memorized long ago. 16 complaints had been filed against Briggs during the previous 5 years. Every single one had disappeared before reaching formal investigation. 3 witnesses had withdrawn statements after reporting intimidation. 2 internal reports had mysteriously vanished. And every road eventually led back to the same network of people sitting comfortably around her today. Briggs noticed her reading and slowly approached again. "You really like those papers, do you not?" He laughed and glanced toward another officer. "Maybe she thinks she is writing a book about us." Several people chuckled. Aaliyah carefully closed the folder and rested her hands on top of it. Her expression never changed. Briggs shook his head. "You know what your problem is? You walk into places like this, expecting people to take you seriously." A few seconds passed. She simply looked at him. Nothing more. That silence unsettled him for reasons he could not explain. Most people argued. Most people defended themselves. She did neither. Across the room, Emily Foster continued observing. She noticed that Aaliyah never reacted emotionally, almost as if she already knew how every conversation would unfold before it happened. Emily suddenly realized something important. This woman was not uncomfortable. She was studying everyone. Meanwhile, Judge Raymond Cole called for the first hearing to begin, but before speaking, he exchanged a brief glance with Briggs. It lasted less than 2 seconds, yet Aaliyah noticed it immediately. Another piece of the puzzle quietly fell into place. She reached inside her briefcase and touched a sealed envelope that carried a federal authorization stamp. Months ago, she promised herself she would not act too early. Timing mattered. One careless move could allow an entire network to disappear before being exposed. So she waited. She listened. She documented everything. Imagine sitting in a room where the people mocking you have no idea they are standing inside their own investigation. Imagine watching someone laugh at you, while they unknowingly hand you the final evidence you need. That was exactly what was happening now. Officer Daniel Briggs thought he was humiliating another stranger. In reality, he was helping complete a case that was already built around him. And while he smiled proudly under the courthouse lights, a single message silently arrived on Aaliyah's secure phone. It contained only 4 words. Team is in position. The moment people begin to feel untouchable is often the exact moment their downfall quietly begins. Aaliyah Carter placed her phone back inside her briefcase and looked toward the front of the courtroom. Nobody else knew what the message meant, but she did. Team is in position. 11 months of preparation had finally reached its final stage. She took a slow breath and watched Officer Daniel Briggs continue walking around the room with the confidence of a man who had never experienced accountability. He greeted attorneys by name, joked with court staff, and occasionally glanced at Aaliyah as if she were an inconvenience that had somehow wandered into his territory. Then he approached her once again. He tapped a finger against her table and smiled. "You are still here. That is surprising. Most people would have gotten the message by now." Aaliyah calmly folded her hands together and met his eyes. Her voice remained soft and steady. "What message would that be, Officer Briggs?" He laughed and looked around, making sure other people could hear him. "The message that some people simply do not belong in rooms like this." A few spectators exchanged uncomfortable looks. Emily Foster immediately lowered her eyes, embarrassed by what she had just heard. But Aaliyah did not react. She simply observed him. That silence made Briggs speak even more. "Funny thing is, people always try to become important instead of accepting where they fit." He leaned slightly closer and smiled. "Maybe today you will learn the difference." Aaliyah nodded once. Then she quietly replied, "Sometimes people misunderstand where power actually sits." Briggs laughed louder than before. "There it is. A mysterious answer. You really think you are somebody, do you not?" He walked away before she could respond, completely unaware that every camera inside the courthouse was now being preserved as evidence under a federal request that had been approved hours earlier. Across the room, Judge Raymond Cole continued reviewing documents, but Aaliyah noticed his hands subtly tighten around his pen every time Briggs spoke. There was anxiety hidden beneath his professional appearance. He knew more than he wanted anyone else to discover. Slowly, Aaliyah opened her briefcase and reviewed a photograph clipped to a file. It showed a timeline connecting multiple dismissed complaints and missing records. Every path eventually returned to the same courthouse. She remembered a retired schoolteacher she had interviewed months ago. The woman had said something that stayed with her ever since. People were not afraid because one person was powerful. They were afraid because too many people stayed silent. That was why Aaliyah was here. She was not trying to punish one officer. She was trying to expose a culture that had been allowed to grow unchecked. Imagine carrying hundreds of stories that nobody else believed. Imagine walking into the very place where those stories began and sitting quietly while everyone underestimated you. That was the burden Aaliyah carried this morning. Yet somehow she looked completely at peace. Then another message appeared on her phone. Final authorization approved. She locked the screen and closed her briefcase. Across the room, Daniel Briggs laughed at another joke and adjusted his badge with pride. But for the first time all morning, Aaliyah noticed something different. His confidence was beginning to outrun his caution. And that was exactly the moment she had been waiting for. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the municipal building felt completely different. The same hallways that had once ignored Amelia Brooks now seemed unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the truth to speak. She walked beside her father, Charles Brooks, carrying herself with calm dignity while dozens of employees pretended to focus on their work. But everyone was watching. Everyone knew something had changed. Officer Daniel Grant sat alone in a conference room, no longer surrounded by confident allies or approving smiles. For the first time in many years, he was being forced to listen instead of being heard. Imagine standing there after spending years believing authority belonged to you, only to realize that respect was never guaranteed. Amelia noticed his expression, but she felt no desire for revenge. Her father had taught her something long ago. Justice was never about humiliation. Justice was about restoring truth. Across the room, investigators carefully reviewed documented complaints that had been ignored for years. One after another, ordinary citizens arrived to share experiences they had kept buried inside themselves. A school teacher, a veteran, a single mother, a retired postal worker. Their voices were different, but their stories sounded painfully familiar. Each person described moments when they felt invisible, moments when they were judged before they even spoke. Aaliyah listened quietly, her hands folded together as she realized this was never only about her. It was about every person who had walked away carrying silent pain. Charles stood near the window, watching the morning sunlight spread across the floor. He was a powerful man, but his face carried sadness instead of pride. He understood something many leaders forgot. Policies could change overnight, but trust took years to rebuild. Then the room grew silent as Officer Grant finally spoke. His voice was lower now, stripped of the arrogance everyone had witnessed before. He admitted that he had become comfortable inside a system that rewarded assumptions instead of understanding people. No dramatic excuses came from him. No attempt to shift responsibility onto others. Just an uncomfortable truth that hung in the air. Aaliyah met his eyes for a moment before speaking softly. She told him that accountability was not the end of someone's story. It was the beginning of becoming someone better. Several people in the room lowered their heads after hearing those words because they understood their own responsibility too. Silence had protected bad habits for far too long. Outside, reporters gathered near the building, but inside, something more important was happening. People were finally listening to each other. The tension that once filled every corner slowly began to dissolve into reflection. Aaliyah took a deep breath and looked around one last time. She was no longer the woman people underestimated yesterday. She was living proof that dignity survives even when others try to diminish it. As she walked toward the exit beside her father, sunlight illuminated the path ahead. And somewhere behind her, a broken cycle was finally beginning to end. Because the most powerful kind of karma does not arrive with anger. It arrives when the truth stands so tall that nobody can pretend not to see it anymore. He once believed his badge defined his worth. But that day, he learned that real authority begins with humanity. 2 days later, the city was no longer talking about a single incident. It was talking about a pattern that had finally been exposed. The investigation, initiated by Charles Brooks, had expanded beyond one department and reached offices that had never expected anyone to ask difficult questions. Aaliyah sat inside a quiet conference room reviewing reports that stretched back nearly a decade. Every page told the same painful story. Complaints dismissed, voices ignored, opportunities for change repeatedly postponed. Imagine discovering that one moment of humiliation was only a small piece of something much larger. Aaliyah felt a deep ache in her chest, not because she was afraid, but because she understood how many people had carried invisible burdens for years. Across the city, citizens began attending community meetings in record numbers. For the first time in a long time, people believed someone was truly listening. Teachers sat beside business owners. Police officers sat beside neighborhood leaders. Elderly residents shared stories they had never told before. Something powerful was happening. Fear was being replaced by conversation. Inside headquarters, Officer Daniel Grant continued cooperating with investigators. His uniform no longer represented unquestioned authority. It had become a reminder that every position of power carried responsibility. He walked slower now. He spoke softer now. One afternoon, he unexpectedly approached Aaliyah in the hallway. The fluorescent lights above them hummed quietly while employees moved around them carrying folders and coffee cups. Life was continuing, but both of them understood they had reached an important moment. Daniel admitted that he had spent years convincing himself that experience automatically made him right. He confessed that he had stopped seeing individuals and had started seeing assumptions instead. Aaliyah listened without interrupting. Sometimes the hardest thing a person could do was admit they had been wrong. She told him that growth only begins when pride steps aside. Her words were simple, but they landed heavily. Nearby employees paused their conversations because they understood this exchange was bigger than two people. It was about changing a culture. Later that evening, Aaliyah stood outside the building watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. Charles joined her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He asked if she was exhausted. She smiled softly and admitted that she was. But she also said something that stayed with him. She said that carrying the truth was heavy, but carrying silence had always been heavier. Charles looked at his daughter with quiet admiration. She had transformed a painful experience into something meaningful for thousands of people she would never meet. The wind moved gently through the trees as city lights slowly turned on one by one. Behind them, a new training program was already being developed. Accountability systems were being strengthened. More importantly, empathy was finally being treated as a strength instead of a weakness. Aaliyah took a deep breath and looked toward the future. She understood that justice was not a destination people reached in one day. It was a decision people made every single day afterward. Because sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating an enemy. It is helping an entire community remember what fairness was supposed to look like all along. 3 weeks later, the city felt different in ways that could not be measured by numbers or headlines. The changes were subtle at first. People greeted one another more often. Public meetings were fuller. Conversations that once ended in frustration now carried cautious hope. Aaliyah Brooks noticed it everywhere she went. She saw it in the eyes of young students visiting City Hall for educational tours. She saw it in the smiles of elderly residents who no longer felt invisible. She even saw it inside the police department itself. New officers sat through training sessions that focused not only on procedures but on humanity. The message was simple. Authority without compassion could never create trust. One afternoon, Aaliyah was invited to speak at a community gathering held inside a large recreation center. More than 200 people filled the room. Parents sat beside teenagers. Officers sat beside local business owners. The atmosphere was calm but emotional. Everyone understood they were witnessing the beginning of something important. Aaliyah walked to the stage without notes in her hands. She did not need them. Her story was already written in her heart. Imagine standing before an entire city after one painful moment changed thousands of lives. She looked around the room and saw people waiting, not for perfection but for honesty. She told them that fear grows in silence, but understanding grows in conversation. She reminded everyone that dignity should never depend on someone's appearance, job title, or neighborhood. Every person deserved respect before they had to earn anything else. The audience remained completely silent because her words touched experiences many of them had carried for years. In the back of the room, Officer Daniel Grant sat quietly among the attendees. He was no longer hiding from accountability. He was choosing to learn from it. When the meeting ended, he approached a group of young cadets entering law enforcement for the first time. He told them something he wished someone had taught him decades earlier. He said that a badge should never become a wall separating officers from the communities they serve. It should become a bridge. Those words surprised many people because they understood how difficult real change could be. Outside, the evening air was warm as the sun slowly disappeared behind the buildings. Charles Brooks stood watching his daughter speak with residents who wanted to thank her. Pride filled his eyes, but it was a quiet kind of pride. Not because she had won a battle, but because she had inspired others to stand with courage. Aaliyah eventually stepped away from the crowd and looked toward the city skyline. Lights stretched across the horizon like tiny reminders that every life mattered. She remembered how small she had felt only weeks earlier. She remembered the humiliation, the uncertainty, and the loneliness. Yet none of those things had defeated her. Instead, they had become fuel for something greater. Because sometimes the people society tries hardest to silence become the voices that teach everyone how to listen. And that was the lesson this city would never forget. He thought power meant being feared. But in the end, everyone discovered that the strongest people are the ones who choose humanity when they have every reason to choose anger. 6 months later, what began as a painful encounter had transformed into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. The city launched a new initiative called the Dignity Project, a program designed to strengthen trust between public servants and the communities they represented. Aaliyah Brooks had not asked for recognition, yet her quiet courage had become the foundation for meaningful change. On a bright Saturday morning, hundreds of families gathered at a public park for the program's first official event. Children ran across the grass while local musicians played soft jazz under white tents. The atmosphere felt peaceful, but beneath that peace was something even more important. There was healing. Imagine standing in a place that once felt divided and realizing people were finally choosing each other instead of their assumptions. Aaliyah walked through the crowd greeting families one by one. She stopped to speak with young students who told her they wanted to become lawyers, teachers, and police officers someday. Each conversation reminded her why this journey mattered. Nearby, Officer Daniel Briggs volunteered alongside new recruits. He no longer carried himself with superiority. Instead, he listened more than he spoke. One little boy asked him a simple question. "What is the most important part of being a police officer?" Daniel paused for a moment before answering. He smiled softly and said that the most important part was remembering that every person you meet has a story you cannot see. Charles Brooks watched the exchange from a distance and quietly nodded. Sometimes the greatest evidence of change was not found inside official documents. It was found inside ordinary moments. As the afternoon continued, a large mural was unveiled near the center of the park. It showed people from different backgrounds standing side by side beneath the sunrise. At the bottom were words that instantly silenced the crowd. Respect first. Assumptions never. Aaliyah stared at those words for several seconds because they perfectly captured everything she had learned. There would always be challenges ahead. There would always be people resistant to change. But progress did not require perfection. It only required enough brave people willing to begin. Later, as evening approached, Aaliyah and her father sat on a bench overlooking a small lake inside the park. The water reflected the golden colors of the setting sun. Neither of them spoke for a while. They simply listened to laughter echoing in the distance. Finally, Charles turned toward his daughter and said something he had been carrying in his heart for months. He told her that true leaders are not the loudest people in the room. They are the ones who inspire others to become better versions of themselves. Aaliyah smiled because she understood now. Her greatest victory was never proving someone wrong. It was proving that kindness could survive injustice, and that dignity could outlive humiliation. As darkness slowly covered the city, lights began to glow in windows all around them. Life moved forward. But this time it moved forward with a little more compassion. Because one moment of truth had reminded an entire community of something easy to forget. Every human being deserves to be seen before they are judged. And sometimes the person the world underestimates becomes the reason the world finally changes. 1 year later, the story that once began with humiliation had become a permanent reminder that truth can travel farther than fear ever will. The city had changed, but more importantly, the people inside it had changed. Schools incorporated lessons about empathy into their programs. Community leaders met regularly with public servants. Young officers entering the profession were trained to understand that every interaction could either build trust or break it. Aaliyah Brooks never asked to become a symbol of change, yet her name quietly carried meaning throughout the community. On a cool autumn evening, she was invited to attend the opening of a new civic center dedicated to unity and public service. Hundreds of people gathered outside beneath strings of warm lights, while a gentle breeze moved through rows of American flags. Imagine standing there after an entire year and realizing that one painful day no longer defined your life. Instead, it became the beginning of a new chapter for thousands of others. Aaliyah walked slowly through the crowd, recognizing familiar faces everywhere. The retired teacher who had once shared her story. The young students who dreamed of becoming leaders. The families who had chosen hope over bitterness. Even Officer Daniel Briggs was there, now working as a mentor for new recruits and helping build programs that encouraged respectful engagement with neighborhoods throughout the city. He had learned a lesson he would never forget. Authority could open doors, but character determined what happened once you stepped through them. As the ceremony began, Charles Brooks stood beside his daughter with quiet pride in his eyes. The mayor approached the podium and spoke about the importance of accountability, but then he said something that made the entire crowd grow silent. He said that every community eventually